The hallway was quiet, but not empty. You could hear it before you saw him. Tap, tap, tap. A cane, worn smooth with time, met the courthouse floor in slow, steady rhythm. He moved like someone who'd learned to measure each step, not in distance, but in cost. His coat hung loose on shoulders that once held more than fabric. His cap, frayed and faded, rested just above eyes that didn't search for sympathy, only silence. Why was he alone in a place where no one comes by choice? And why did no one seem to notice, except you? He didn't rush. He didn't ask. He didn't look lost. But something about the way he placed that old cap on the bench beside him, so gently, so deliberately, said, this moment mattered. Not all heroes have monuments. Some just want their name remembered, one last time. If you understand that, you're in the right place. Subscribe to American Quiet Courage. He sat at the edge of courtroom 2B like a man waiting for his number to be called at the DMV, only this number had nothing to do with licenses. He didn't check a watch. He didn't sigh. He didn't even glance at the officer who passed him twice, never meeting his eye. He simply folded his hands over his lap and stared down at the floor as if it were the only place that hadn't judged him yet. On the tile beside him sat a green cap, standard issue, army stamped, sun-bleached by years without a roof. It was the kind of thing most people would miss. But not the judge. And not you. The courtroom clerk called his name like it was just another file in a long morning stack. Case number 427B, Isaac Roland. No one stirred. No lawyer stood up. No family turned in their seat. Just the soft creak of the bench as the old man shifted forward slightly, acknowledging the call the way someone does when they've grown used to not being noticed. The prosecutor adjusted his tie and began reading. Charged with petty theft from a local grocery. No fixed address. Multiple prior citations for loitering. His voice was calm, practiced, the kind used for paperwork more than people. Isaac didn't flinch. He sat still, hands folded, cap resting neatly on the bench beside him. A quiet figure in a system that doesn't pause for quiet things. The public defender at his side leaned in and whispered something, likely a suggestion, not a question. Isaac didn't reply. He only gave a slow nod. Like someone who's heard every version of this before. There were no photos offered. No character references. No one in the back row stood up to vouch for him. Just a man who looked like he had nowhere else to be. And yet, the way he sat, there was no shame. No defiance, either. Only something heavier. The kind of heaviness you don't see on a police report. The judge glanced at the file. Then at the man. Then at the file again. A beat passed. Then two. She looked back at the cap and didn't turn the page. Judge Evelyn Hart had been on the bench long enough to recognize patterns. Charges like these pass through her courtroom every week: petty theft, no known residence, no one to speak on the defendant's behalf. She reached for the next page in the file, but paused. Her eyes moved, not to Isaac, but to the object beside him. That cap. It wasn't just old. It was worn with intention. The kind of wear that doesn't come from neglect, but from being carried everywhere, every day. Faded green, the stitching nearly gone at the edges. The front still bore the faint imprint of where a patch had once been. She didn't say a word. Didn't ask about it. But her fingers slowed on the paper. Her body, so often steady with the rhythm of routine, hesitated. The prosecutor kept speaking, citing previous citations like items on a checklist. But Evelyn didn't hear him anymore. Her gaze stayed on the cap. Something about the way it rested on the bench, carefully placed, not dropped. It wasn't just an old hat. It was the kind of thing a man keeps when he has nothing else left to carry. She glanced back at Isaac. Still, he didn't look up. Still, he said nothing. And in that silence, something inside her shifted, just slightly. Not enough for the room to notice. But enough for her to close the file. And take a breath. The courtroom fell quiet as Judge Hart looked up from the closed file. "Mr. Roland," she said gently. "Do you wish to say anything before I consider the next steps?" Isaac nodded once and stood with effort, gripping the side of the table to steady himself. His voice, when it came, was low, raspy, but clear. "I didn't come here to argue," he said. "And I didn't come here to explain." He paused, his eyes still on the floor. "I was hungry. That's all. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. No anger. No defensiveness. Just facts, stated plainly, as if there were no point in dressing them up." Someone in the back coughed, then whispered too loudly, "That's what shelters are for." No one turned around. But Isaac must have heard. He didn't respond. He just adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, then returned his hand to the table. Judge Hart watched him closely. He hadn't asked for leniency. He hadn't even asked to be heard. She glanced at the prosecutor, who had no questions. No objections. Only silence. The moment hung in the air, not because of what had been said, but because of what hadn't. There was no story offered. No excuse, no justification. Just a man who took the weight of his actions with the same quiet he seemed to carry everything else. And yet, something about that quiet was louder than most voices she'd heard from that bench. She didn't write anything down. She just looked at him. And waited. Judge Hart didn't speak right away. She leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly beneath her robe, and let the quiet settle over the room. Isaac remained standing, not out of protest, but simply because no one had told him to sit. His hands rested at his sides. His cap stayed on the bench. His eyes never left the floor. There was a stillness to him, not the kind that asks for attention, but the kind that speaks of long waits and colder mornings. Judge Hart looked at the courtroom, then back at the man in front of her. And then she did something no one expected. She stood. Slowly. Deliberately. Without a word. Chairs shifted. Papers rustled. People glanced around, unsure if they had missed something. But she didn't offer explanation. Her gaze was steady, but her posture had changed. She wasn't towering now. She was level. Face to face with a man who had said very little, but somehow said enough. No gavel. No legal language. Just a quiet gesture from someone who had seen thousands of cases, but rarely paused in the middle of one. A bailiff shifted uneasily. The prosecutor looked up from his notes. Still, no one spoke. Isaac glanced up, just for a second. Just enough to meet her eyes. And in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them. Not recognition exactly, but something close. She looked down at the bench, at the cap, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she stayed standing. Judge Hart remained standing for a moment longer, then slowly returned to her seat. But the silence she'd created didn't leave the room. It lingered, stretched thin across the walls like something sacred had just passed through. She opened the file again, this time not to the summary, but to the back where clerks sometimes tucked paperwork no one expected to matter. There, folded between two pages, was a single typed sheet, yellowed at the corners. A note attached in faded ink. For record only. She lifted it gently, smoothing the creases as her eyes scanned the page. It wasn't a legal brief. Not an affidavit. It was a letter. Written years ago by someone named Vaughn. The tone was plain, almost reluctant, like a man unsure if anyone would ever read what he was trying to say. It spoke of a supply run gone wrong. A convoy under fire. A man who drove straight into danger so others wouldn't have to. It didn't mention medals. Just moments. The kind most people forget because they never make headlines. And at the end, one line that made her pause. If he ever stands before you, don't listen to what the charges say. Watch how he stands. Watch what he carries. She looked up. Isaac still stood where she'd last seen him, hands at his sides, back straight, eyes quiet. And beside him, that cap. She folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the file, and closed the folder without a sound. Judge Hart leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the bench. She didn't look at the papers. She didn't reach for her pen. She looked at Isaac. Not like a judge looks at a defendant. Not with authority. Not with distance. Just as one human being looks at another when they realize they've missed something important. The room stayed quiet, still caught in the afterglow of something it couldn't quite name. A few people shifted in their seats. A cough came from the back. But no one dared break the moment. She took a breath, not to speak, but to steady whatever was moving just beneath her voice. Mr. Roland, she said. We'll be pausing proceedings temporarily to verify details that may affect how this case is handled moving forward. Her tone was formal. But her eyes weren't. Isaac didn't nod. He didn't question. He just returned her gaze slowly, gently, as if he hadn't looked directly at anyone in a long time. And what passed between them wasn't permission. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something quieter than that. Recognition. Not of identity, but of weight. Of how some men carry more than we'll ever know, and never say a word about it. She looked away only when she had to. Back to the file, now closed again. The cap stayed where it was. And so did the silence. The bailiff stepped forward, not to escort Isaac out, but simply to gesture that he could sit. Isaac nodded once and lowered himself gently onto the bench, his hands resting on his knees, the cane propped beside him like it always had been. Judge Hart rose from her seat, her robe catching the light as she turned toward the clerk's desk. Her steps were measured. No rush, no drama, just the quiet cadence of someone doing something that mattered, without needing the room to notice. She spoke briefly with the clerk. Low tones. No fanfare. Across the courtroom, no one clapped. There were no gasps, no headlines forming in the back row. Just the muffled scratch of a pen marking something on a docket sheet. Justice didn't arrive in grand words that day. It arrived in the space between them. In the way she had looked at him. In the way he hadn't asked for anything. Outside the window, the sun shifted across the floor tiles. The light touched Isaac's boots, the hem of his coat, and the edge of that worn-out cap. It made no sound. But somehow, it felt like a gesture. He adjusted the cap slightly on the bench beside him. Not to claim it. Not to explain it. Just to make sure it stayed upright. And for the first time that morning, he looked straight ahead. Sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with a gavel or a headline. Sometimes, it shows up quietly, in the way a judge pauses, or in the way a man adjusts a worn-out cap so it won't fall over. Isaac Roland never raised his voice. He didn't demand to be seen. But he reminded us that dignity doesn't depend on wealth, or status, or even shelter. It lives in how we carry ourselves, especially when we think no one is watching. This story teaches us that recognition is not about attention, it's about humanity. And that one silent moment, shared between two people who chose to see each other, can shift the course of everything. Have you ever witnessed quiet courage like that? Or been moved by someone who didn't ask for thanks, but deserved far more than they received? If this story stayed with you, please like, share, and subscribe to American Quiet Courage, where stories like Isaac's are honored the way they should be, with truth, stillness, and heart.